Kent, and good afternoon. It's my delight and honor to be here with you today, and we're here celebrating 10 years since the Civil Rights Room here in the Nashville Public Library opened. I want to pause for just a minute here and acknowledge a couple of my friends, Bill and Robin King, without whose generosity and vision none of this would be possible. So please help me thank Bill and Robin. Since 2003, tens of thousands of people have attended public programs associated with the Civil Rights Room and Collection. Some of our more notable programs have included the Lessons of Nonviolence with John Lewis, Bernard Lafayette, Jim Bevel, John Siegenthaler, Jim Lawson, Diane Nash, and C.T. Vivian, the Freedom Riders, and the Music of the Movement. In 2010, the focus of the public programs and community engagement shifted to include current national and pressing issues as part of Conversations at NPL series, and included such programs as A New Dialogue in Civil Rights with NPR's Juan Williams, and Separate but Never Equal, The Other Side of Segregation. Since 2003, the Civil Rights Room and Collection has touched over 26,000 learners of all ages. Today, we welcome Michele Norris, an award-winning journalist with more than 2 decades of experience. She is currently a host and special correspondent for NPR. Previously, Norris served as co-host of NPR's news magazine, All Things Considered, public radio's longest-running national program with Robert Siegel and Melissa Block. Norris began hosting the program in December 2002 and stepped away from her All Things Considered duties during the 2012 presidential campaign. While on sabbatical, Norris spent a time traveling the country and developing 2 successful initiatives, the Race Card Project and NPR's Backseat Book Club. Her new role will allow her to continue this work while producing in-depth segments for all NPR programs. Michele Norris has a voice that is undeniably recognizable and that embodies both authority and calm. Captivating and astute on air, Norris has presented leading news weighing in on American culture, including race and the influence of new media, since she joined NPR in 2002. Prior to her tenure at NPR, she served as an ABC News correspondent, where she covered education, America's inner cities, the national drug problem, poverty, and most recognizably, the aftermath of 9/11. Norris has received many honors in journalism and for her insight into American culture and social issues, including the Peabody Award, the DuPont Award, and Journalist of the Year by the National Association of Black Journalists. She was recently named to Essence Magazine's 25 Most Influential Black Americans. In September 2010, Norris published her first book, The Grace of Silence, a memoir, which she will be signing after the program today. The book focuses on how America talks about race in the wake of the Obama presidency, and how her own complex legacy has shaped her dedication to informing others through sound and voice. Compelling, thoughtful, insightful. Norris's personality is hard to match. Please join me in giving a warm applause and welcome to Michele Norris.
Hello, everyone. Brenda, thank you for that wonderful introduction. It's always interesting to listen to people go on and on about what you've done and what you've won. I'm just a gal that talks on the radio. And when I talk on the radio, I can only imagine the audience that's out there in their cars and in their kitchens. And so when I get out of the studio and away from the mothership at NPR, it's wonderful to be able to talk to you in person. People always say to me, "Oh, I have a face to go with the voice." I can say, "I have a face to go with the audience." It's wonderful to be able to talk to you in person. Thank you so much for having me. And It's a particular honor to be able to come here to Nashville at this moment, the 10-year anniversary of the Civil Rights Collection. Here at the library upstairs, I had a chance to spend some time up there. What a wonderful treasure that you have here at the library, and thank you very much to the King family for making that possible. It was really, really special to be able to spend time up there, and also to be here in the week that Nelson Mandela has gone to glory. And when we think about the sacrifices, the incredible sacrifices that he made as a warrior, but also as a man of incredible grace. My book is called The Grace of Silence, and I spent a lot of time in writing that book and now talking about it and thinking about that word grace and how we don't have enough of it in our lives, and particularly the intersection of grace and race, or grace and racial conflict. There are so many lessons to divine from his life, and you need to take in all of them to really understand his legacy, that he was a fighter, but he was also someone who could stare down his anger. I think one of the things, and I'm just going to say take a moment to say this about him, because I've been thinking a lot about this, is I've heard so much commentary since his passing that he was someone who managed to emerge from prison after 27 years free of bitterness. I do not think that is correct. I don't think that he was free of bitterness. I think that for someone to have lost 27 years of his life, he had to have been bitter. For someone who loved children so much, and I was there in South Africa for his inauguration, and when you saw him with children, you saw how much he loved being surrounded by children. And when you read his book, he talked about how important fatherhood was to him. In fact, when he was on the run, he snuck to his home one evening to tuck his son into bed. And no one knew about that. He wrote about it in Long Walk to Freedom. He loved children, but he went 27 years without holding a child, without listening to a child's voice. That's what prison does to you. It separates you from society. He was not with those he loved. He was not with Winnie. So I think when he left, he probably was mighty bitter. But what was incredible is that he did battle with his anger, and he emerged victorious. That he was able to take that bitterness and put it away someplace so he could be an effective statesman. And I think it's important to recognize that that bitterness was there inside him, and to understand that he did battle with it and won, and in recognizing that, you realize truly how magnificent a leader that he was. That applies to so many people who walk among us as well. There are a lot of people in America right now who have their own reasons to be bitter when they remember the America that we now commemorate on holidays and in history books and in documentaries and in big milestones. And there are many of those people who have reason to be bitter and have figured out how not to be. I know that to be true because I was raised by two of them. And it's what led me to write this book, this family memoir, The Grace of Silence. I wrote that book by accident. It wasn't the book that I was intending to write. We had a chance to talk today and realize how much of my life happens by accident. But this was a case where I didn't intend to write that book. 3 years ago, when I started out on this journey, I wanted to write a book about how Americans talk and think about race. And that itself was a surprise to me, because as an African American who has spent more than 3 decades in newsrooms, I would bristle sometimes when I was always asked to be the one who was writing about race. When you are an African American in a largely white newsroom, you're called upon a lot. What do you think about this? Would you mind covering this? And that I didn't mind, so much, but it got to be, I wondered, why am I always the person who's writing about race? Why am I so popular in the month of February? And it got to the point when I had a little bit of experience where I would say, you know what, if I have not seen you the other 11 months of the year, don't come to me in February with an assignment. And by the way, it is the shortest month of the year. So I did not want to be the person who was always writing and thinking about race. I wanted a full docket. I wanted to cover foreign policy. I wanted to cover finance. I wanted to do all the things that journalists generally like to do. I didn't want to, have this portfolio that was primarily about race and racial conflict and racial reconciliation and just, stories, 8 different ways of talking about race. And at this point in my career, that's the largest part of my docket. I've spent much of the last 3 years talking and thinking about race. And that's the way it should be. I don't mind it now because I realize that it is such a rich opportunity to understand American history and to invite people into a conversation that sometimes they have a hard time with, have a hard time finding the way to segue or to merge into that conversation. And so for me, I started to get more comfortable around that with the campaign leading up to the election in 2008. And one of the reasons that I became more comfortable was out of curiosity around this word that was everywhere, beginning in about 2007. And I've actually done some research around this. The word was nowhere and suddenly it was everywhere. You know what word I'm talking about? Post-racial? Remember that word? Now, it was everywhere, and I've literally done research around this. It was used less than a dozen times in popular culture and American journalism leading up to early 2007. And then suddenly it was salted in conversation everywhere. It was in commentary, it was in newspaper columns, and it was a curious word. Did we even know what it meant? I'm going to do a call and response. I'm going to ask you, what do you think it meant, post-racial? Anyone want to venture? No more racism? After Obama, of course. Yeah. After Obama, no more racism. Everybody's the same color. Everyone's the same color. Anybody else? The point at which race perhaps mattered less. Yes. Well, how did that turn out? And I'm not one to say told you so, but when I was starting to hear this word, I was thinking, that's really interesting because I was traveling a lot. At that point, that was the first campaign. My husband worked in the second campaign, and that's when I recused myself and stepped away from the hosting chair. But in the first campaign, I was actually traveling a lot. I was covering that campaign. I was spending a lot of time in Iowa and New Hampshire and South Carolina and elsewhere in the country. And I thought something was happening that suggested that we weren't entering a post-racial status. I was listening to people talk about race in very animated ways. I'm not saying they were obsessed with it, but people were thinking about race in a different way, and they were starting to talk about it. And so my idea was to try to capture that. And we did it first on the radio through a series of conversations that I did with my colleague, Steve Inskeep, wonderful journalist, dear friend of mine. And we decided to team up together and do a series of conversations where we would invite our listeners to have an open and candid conversation about race. Actually, a series of conversations. We did it in York, Pennsylvania, because it's very close to Washington, D.C. National Public Radio is located in Washington. We had to choose someplace close because we wanted to visit multiple times. We figured that having a conversation about race would be a bit like peeling an onion. You'd have to, and including the tears that go along with that perhaps, but you had to do it, you had to spend enough time to peel the layers. So we figured we couldn't do it in one trip. We wanted to go back and forth a few times. And in order for Steve and I to do that together, it had to be someplace close because we were both hosting shows, me in the afternoon, he in the morning. And it had to be someplace close because we were on very different schedules. Steve Inskeep lives a little bit like a vampire because he goes to work at 2 o'clock in the morning. And they're done at about noon, and that, when I was hosting the afternoon show, that's about the time that my day is ramping up. So we were like ships passing in the night, or in the afternoon in that case, so we needed someplace close. So we chose York, Pennsylvania. It was close enough to us. It had an interesting history regarding race. There was some racial tumult. There are some wounds that had never really fully healed. It was a manufacturing center, so it had great diversity, and on all kinds of diversity, really, not just racial diversity, but it had good socioeconomic diversity. There were interesting immigration patterns, both in the past and currently, so it was a really good and yeasty place to do this conversation. And we both had ideas about what we would do to put people in a room and to create a space where we could have an honest and a comfortable conversation. Because again, we're still operating with the idea that race is this thing that's really hard to talk about. So Steve had this idea that if we were going to bring people together, that we had to do it in a room that had a fireplace. The producers were going crazy, trying to find a room. He believed that if we were someplace with a roaring fire, that it would just melt away all inhibitions, and we would have this wonderful conversation. And so they were trying to find a room that had, it's not easy to find. In fact, in the back, there's an open hearth back there. I don't know what they're planning to use that for, like a production or something. There actually is one back there, and I laughed when I saw it, when Rachel and I were walking back here, because when we were in Pennsylvania, the producers were at the moment where they were going to go to Lowe's and buy one of those fireplaces that you can just smack up against the wall. Do you know what I'm talking about? They were like, we're just going to buy one and put it in a room. And right when they were at that point, they discovered that there was a suite at a local hotel, an older hotel in York, Pennsylvania, that had recently been vacated. A gentleman had been living there for many years, and he had moved on to an assisted living facility, so he left it vacant and it was available to us. And because he had lived there for a long time, not only did it have a hearth, but it had a hearth that had all kinds of wonderful trinkets and things on the mantle, so it looked like your Aunt Millie had lived there or something. It was perfect. Steve was very happy. And I'll just say as an aside, Steve Inskeep recently did a very interesting interview with President Obama about 4 weeks ago. I don't know if you remember hearing it on Morning Edition. But the White House, as it is wont to do, took an official photo and released that, and we were able to use that on the website. And I laughed out loud because they did it in a room with a hearth. It was like there was a big hearth in back of it, so a big fireplace, so it was really funny to see that. I had a particular idea for the conversation. I thought that if we were going to bring people together and ask them to have an honest conversation about a difficult topic, it would help if we lubricated the conversation with really good food. So I said, let's sit down and have a meal together before we talk. And so we pulled people together. It was 15 for the first installment, and the next two conversations it grew to 16 people. And they were from all over York, and there was great diversity in that room. And I don't know if it was the hearth or the pasta, I'm not sure, or the cake. But whatever happened, it worked. People got in that space, and they got comfortable. Men do that thing that they do after Thanksgiving where they're trying to be slick and they're trying to undo their belt buckle. Women took off their earrings and kicked off their shoes, and people really got comfortable, and it was magical radio. It was a really special moment for us, and I'm not saying that because I'm trying to pat myself on the back. I'm saying that because it was something you don't hear often enough probably on the radio. It was a totally honest conversation about race, honest to the point that it sometimes made us uncomfortable. But it was honest, and it was honesty that was based on a series of really simple questions. We asked people, do Black Americans make too much of race? Are they always looking for race? Do white Americans understand their privilege? This was leading up to the election in 2008, so Sarah Palin was the vice presidential nominee on the Republican ticket. When Sarah Palin talked about Joe Sixpack, what did he look like? Was he Latino? Was he South Asian? Was that a code word for something else? And it was interesting because in our group, we had a gentleman who was South Asian. He owned a corner store. It was a combination deli and convenience market. And he was an immigrant, and he loved America. And to show how much he loved America, he took the side of the building, it was a corner lot, and on the side of the two-story building, he painted a two-story flag. So in case you didn't understand that he loved America, you would clearly understand it when you came to his restaurant. And he explained that when he went through his process of cutting the payroll every 2 weeks, after he paid the person at the front counter, after he paid the woman who served food, after he paid the person who flipped eggs and made bacon in the back, and when he finally cut a check for himself, every 2 weeks, he would set aside a little bit of his personal funds for a six-pack. And yet he did not think that Sarah Palin had him in mind when she talked about Joe's six-pack. It was a really interesting series of conversations. They were called Race and the 2008 Vote. They live online. I invite you to listen to them. We probably should have been more creative in the title. Something more than race in the 2008 vote, but it was a wonderful experience for us as journalists, and we both wanted a little bit more after that. And for me, I wanted to go out into the country and actually go to strip malls and college campuses and town squares and church basements, places where people had that honest conversation about race, and I wanted to chronicle it a little bit. And that was my desire when I took this book leave. That's what I was planning to do. And what happened was when I was trying to listen to these really honest conversations about race wherever I went, I realized that I was suddenly witness to an entirely different conversation, different kind of conversation about race in my own family. Somehow, in the run-up to the election in 2008, members of my family started to talk about race in a way that was foreign to me. Suddenly, the older members of my family, older African Americans, who remembered a very different America, started shedding stories. And it was always over dinner or breakfast or lunch. It was always at the table, but it was as if they were having some sort of historic indigestion. And all these stories were just sort of bubbling up. Pass the peas. You know what happened in 1964? Let me tell you. And they had kept a lot of this to themselves, but suddenly they were spilling all these stories. And the more I learned in the telling of these stories, the more I realized how little I knew about my own family history, and really how little I knew about American history. I'd watched all the documentaries. I had, written umpteen articles and did umpteen broadcasts about race, but there were all these little moments that I didn't know about. And it bothered me. It bothered me as a journalist. It bothered me as the journalist in the family, because when you're the journalist in the family, you're supposed to be the one that kind of chronicles stuff. And there was so much that I didn't know, and I realized that I was probably writing the wrong book. And I set out on a different journey and tried to learn a little bit more about these family stories and a little bit more about American history. So I could better understand my family, but also take the opportunity to better understand America. And to help you understand the vertigo that I experienced, I'm going to read, if you will allow me to, just a section from the introduction. And it'll help you understand just how topsy-turvy this period was for me. And you'll have to forgive me, because and I lost my glasses. My reading glasses, so if I'm squinting, just forgive me. You see, I've always known that my racial identity has largely been forged by the sum of experiences in my lifetime, and that my most formative memories flow through my parents' lives, from their struggles and tribulations, their triumphs and celebrations, their dignity found through a hard day's work, the devotion of our worship, the places we lived, and above all, the constant expectation captured by one word: rise. Rise and shine. Rise to the occasion. Rise above it all. No matter what, move forward, never backward, always onward and upward. And if you ever feel like you're at the end of your rope, tie a knot and hold on until you can start climbing again. For all of our lives, we were told, keep your eye on the prize, stay strong, keep committed, focus on the fight for justice and equality, set your sights on excellence and opportunity, don't let up, don't look back, don't slow down, ignore the slights and the slurs and the laws that try to keep you from achieving your goals. Always keep the prize in mind, see it, smell it, feel it. Our parents armed us with what they thought we needed. Strength, courage, and a touch of indignation, but just a touch. I was shaped by the advice and admonitions that rained down on me. I have always known that. What I did not know until I began this project, until I began writing this book, is that I was also shaped by the weight of my parents' silence. I originally wanted to write about how other people talked about race, but that presumption was swiftly disabused when I learned about secrets in my own family that had purposely been kept from me. Among those secrets was this. As a young man, my father had been shot by a white policeman. He never spoke about the incident after leaving Birmingham, Alabama, and moving north. He never told even my mother. He took the story to his grave. But my mother, she too was hiding something. My mother never talked about the time her mother, my grandmother, spent time working as a traveling Aunt Jemima, swooping through small Midwestern towns in a hoop skirt and headscarf to perform pancake-making demonstrations for farm women. That memory had caused her shame, so she'd locked it away. These revelations suggest to me that in certain ways, I've never had a full understanding of my parents or the formation of my own racial identity. But they help me also understand that I've never had a full understanding of the story of race in America. Because that story is so often told or so often built around big seismic moments, lunch counter sit-ins, the Trayvon Martin verdict, immigration protests, the death of Nelson Mandela, the election of Barack Obama, the work of Cesar Chavez. But the story about race in America is a mosaic, and it's made up of all kinds of little fragments, little teeny stories, and stories that are often not captured in history books or documentaries. It's why the work that they're doing here is so important in capturing oral history, because in all those oral histories lie those little teeny shards that make up this bigger mosaic. I now know so much more about my family, but it was difficult to do this. It's hard work to pull those stories out, because race is something that is difficult to talk about. And when I was doing the research for this book, I was not particularly popular in my family. As I explained, my father did not talk about his shooting. But when I went back and started talking to relatives about it, it turned out that all of his brothers, of course, they all knew. They were living in the house with him when this happened. All the cousins knew. All the second cousins knew. In fact, everybody in the neighborhood in Ensley, Alabama, my father's family's from Birmingham. I don't know if you know Birmingham or if you know Ensley, but everybody knew that Belvin was shot. I spent every summer in Birmingham, every single summer in Birmingham, and yet I did not know this. My father was married to my mother for a long time, and she did not know this. She learned it from me. Now imagine, in all the intimacies of marriage, that he never managed to tell her that. It was like they all took a collective oath not to talk about it, in part because it was difficult, but in part because, it reminded me, I ran track in high school. And anybody in here run track? Do you still hear the coach's voice in your head? Don't look back over your shoulder. I mean, that's part of what you learn when you run track, is you don't look to the right, you don't look to the left, you never look backwards if you want to run. And I think that that's the way they thought about it. We're not looking back, we're moving forward. But there was something else. They didn't want to freight the next generation with difficult stories. When I talked about Nelson Mandela, and I don't think I'm trying to put my family on the same level with that great man, but part of what I've learned is how people deal with bitterness. And I realized that one of the reasons that they didn't talk about it was also that they didn't want to pass that bitterness on to us, that it would calcify us, that it would weigh us down if they passed on all those stories. And I realized that I was raised by a man who could have gotten up every day with his fist balled up and be angry at the world. My father walked in a very particular way. When I learned about his shooting, something inside me sort of shifted, actually, because he had a scar on his leg. Never knew why it was there. And he had a very particular way of walking. In fact, my father had five brothers. There are six Norris men. When you buy the book, you'll see a picture of them. They were handsome. They were 6 men who loved to look good. They were 6 men who knew they were fine. And my mom and my aunts always used to joke about that, how they sort of smelled themselves, is what they said. And they dressed in and I now realize why my parents were so type A also, that they were always, the kids would call it trying to represent, trying to show, America what they could be in the way that they dressed and the way that they comported themselves. They were dapper men. They liked to look good. Their clothes were always, a sharp crease in their pants, and the cars were always, Saturday, every single one of them would be washing their cars. You could apply makeup in the chrome of their cars. And they wore hats, and they all had this way of walking, in the way that, and I'm not trying to traffic in stereotypes, but in the way that black men sometimes just have a little something extra when they walk. Do you know what I'm talking about? Do you know what I'm talking about? Okay, if you don't, think about President Obama when he walks up to the podium. Do you know what I'm talking about? There's always that little extra. It's just like a little extra something in the shoulder. He never walks up the stairs. He always kind of jogs up the stairs. It's just a little something. If you can't picture that in your mind, think about Denzel Washington. Now, that happens every time. It's like Denzel Washington. And someone always, It's like I mentioned fried chicken, chocolate cake, But the way that Denzel Washington walks, and there's one foot that just lands a little bit later than the other one. So my father and all of his brothers, they each had they called it having a little English in their walk. My father's was a bit more pronounced. You wouldn't say it was a limp, but there was just a little something extra. It was a remnant of his wound. And he never talked about it. And when I think about it now, I think about, in addition to that wound, that he was dragging something else with him. This history that he chose not to talk about, but was with him every day. He was just lugging that along with him. And as difficult as it was for me to research this, I am so glad that I have this story. As difficult as it was to go back and look at the police record, because I was able to find the police record. When my father was shot by a policeman, he was shot because he was trying to enter a building called the Pythian Temple. It is in the black-owned business district in Birmingham. There were 2 black-owned buildings, the Masonic building and the Pythian Temple. And he was trying to enter that building, and a police officer tried to stop him. Now, my father was very zen. He was a very quiet man. They used to jokingly call him E.F. Hutton. He would not talk a lot, but when he said something, it was very wise. He was just, of the brothers, he was the quiet one. He always had a very, very sunny and open disposition, but he wasn't chatty. And he was very kind of a pacifist. And so it was hard for me to imagine why he would stand up to a policeman who tried to prevent his entry into a public building. Now, if you know anything about Birmingham in 1946, for a man of color to stand up to a policeman in Bull Connor, Alabama, was to invite a special kind of trouble. I had to understand why he would do this. The building that he was entering would normally be empty in evening hours. And even since I've written this book, I've learned so much more about Birmingham in 1946 when this happened. The building that he was entering normally would be empty because it was a building filled with doctors' offices, dentists' offices. Very prosperous black businessmen ran a huge insurance operation out of that building. And there was a social club in there, but there wasn't a lot of activity in the evening hours. And yet, in 1946, that building was bustling at night because many of those businesses gave their offices over to people who would be running classes at night. And returning servicemen, black men who had been in World War II, who had just returned to Birmingham, would be going into these classrooms, the insurance office that was serving as a classroom, to learn as much as they could about the US Constitution. Ooh. That thing that shifted, there it went again. My father loved the Constitution. He never went to college, but he considered himself a little constitutional scholar. He used to carry a pocket copy of the Constitution in his back pocket all the time. He used to quiz us about it, and shame on me, I used to tease him about it. If he had lived long enough, do you remember 2 years ago when the House of Representatives recited the Constitution? If he was still with us, he would be in his cardigan and his gold toe slippers, walking around his house, listening on the radio, because he always listened to the radio, reciting the Constitution right along with him. The reason that those men, and there were women too, but they were primarily men, there were whacks and waves, but these are primarily black men who had served in the military. The reason that they were taking courses in the Constitution is because Alabama law held at that point that if you wanted to register to vote, the registrar could point to any section of the Constitution and require and ask that you could recite that you fully understood the US Constitution. This was a result of something called the Boswell Amendment, which was hastily passed after a Supreme Court case called Smith v. Allwright. There was actually a Texas case, but the ruling, the Supreme Court decision in Smith v. Allwright outlawed white-only primaries throughout the South. And this caused great consternation throughout the entire South, including here in Tennessee, because it changed the political calculus. If black people were allowed, Negroes as they were called at that time, to register in large numbers, it would completely change the political calculus. So states responded to the Smith v. Allwright case in individual ways. In Alabama, they passed something called the Boswell Amendment. And the Boswell Amendment held that in order to register, the registrar could ask that you had to fully understand the US Constitution. Well, the veterans at that time, who had participated in the fight for democracy overseas and wanted a taste of it back home, responded in the way the kids today would say, perhaps game on. If we're supposed to know as much about if we're supposed to know about the Constitution, we're going to learn as much as possible about the Constitution. And that's what was going on in February of 1946 at the Pythian Temple the night that my father tried to enter that building. I realized how fortunate my father was because he was only wounded. And it's weird to say that it's someone who shot. Was fortunate. But when I did the research and I learned what was going on, not just in Birmingham, Alabama, but throughout not just the American South, but the entire country in February of 1946, I realized how truly fortunate he was. In the first 6 weeks, my father was wounded on February 7th, 1946. It would have fallen within this period. In the first 6 weeks of 1946, half a dozen black veterans were reportedly killed by police officers in and around Birmingham, Alabama, usually because they were trying to register to vote. In one case, which actually happened just slightly after my father was wounded, Timothy Hood, who was a Marine who had returned to Birmingham, was shot in the head. He was on a bus. It was cold. That February was very cold in Birmingham, and he was on a streetcar. He was on a bus, and it was very cold, and he went to sit. He moved the colored-only sign and wanted to sit up closer to the front because that's where the heater was. And they called ahead, and they called police officers, and when police officers responded, they took him and they put him in the back of a car, and he was shot in the head. less than a week after my father was wounded, another man was brutalized in South Carolina. In fact, throughout the year of 1946, black veterans throughout the country were, this is hard to talk about, they were beaten and maimed and burned, blowtorched in Minden, Louisiana. They were castrated, they were blinded, they were lynched. The blinding of Isaac Woodard is a story that has incredible significance in American history, and most people don't know it. Isaac Woodard, less than a week after my father was wounded, Isaac Woodard was traveling from Georgia to North Carolina, Fort Gordon in Georgia to North Carolina. He was still wearing his Army uniform. And when they were passing through South Carolina, they were entering the town called Batesburg, and they were near Aiken, South Carolina, and he had to make water. And so he told the bus driver that he needed to make water. The bus driver didn't like the tone that he used, so he radioed ahead, and two police officers, led by Linwood Scholl, met him and pulled him off a bus and pulled him into a little alley, and they beat him with blackjacks, which are sort of like billy clubs, but they're filled with pellets. And they beat him primarily around the face and the eyes, such that he was blinded. This case so troubled Harry Truman that Harry Truman convened several meetings about this. He wrote to family members about this. It was that case, more than anything else, that led Harry Truman to sign the executive order that led to the integration of the armed forces. Now, how many of you ever heard of Isaac Woodard? I travel all over the country and talk about this, but did you raise your hand, ma'am? You are in a minority there. Most people had not heard of Isaac Woodard. His story has been largely lost to history because it's a difficult history and people have stopped talking about it. As hard as it was to gather these stories, I am so happy that I can share them with you, that I can share them with my children. People ask me all the time, you called this book The Grace of Silence, and yet you encourage people to talk about this difficult subject. There seems to be a disconnect there. Well, I realize that I benefited from the silences in my family, that my father didn't pass on his anger, but I also realize that I have inherited a special kind of wealth in now understanding these stories and the import behind them. Your history is part of your wealth, even when that history is difficult. I began by talking about Nelson Mandela, and we want to remember him as this iconic hero. Well, to understand his heroism, you need to understand also that when he was fighting for rights, at one point, he did not think that Indians should have those rights in South Africa. The same man who was one of the first people, the first international leaders to fight for the rights of gays and lesbians, at one point didn't believe that everyone should have rights. But you realize that he evolved. And as a people, we're always interested in revolutions. Sometimes evolutions are as important as revolutions. And haven't we been through an incredible evolution in this country? We've evolved to the point that we can gather here on a Saturday afternoon and look around you. Look to your right and your left. If we were trying to do this 50 years ago, it would not be possible. Not in this city, not in this room. And so to understand what that means, it means embracing all of that history, even the difficult aspects of it. And that's why I believe that history is wealth. A long time ago, before we measured wealth in terms of currency, we measured wealth in terms of stories. And your story was you were deemed to be affluent if your story was interesting. And your story was interesting only if it had peaks and valleys. Not if the sun was shining all the time and the crops were always good. The story was interesting if you overcame difficulties, and haven't we all done that. And so I have become, if I can use this word, almost evangelical in encouraging people to capture their history and to wade into this story of race in America, even though it will sometimes give you indigestion. I liken it to cooking with onions. Sometimes they make you cry, Sometimes they do give you indigestion, but they usually deepen the flavor in the end, don't they? And so when I encourage people to talk about race, I came up with this idea. I think you were all given these when you walked in the room. When I wrote this book, I knew that when I went out into the country to talk about race, that I would be asking, I talk about my book, I would be asking people to talk about race. And I thought that might give people indigestion. So I said, well, maybe I can make it a little bit easier by encouraging people to participate in a little exercise. To think about the word race, whatever comes to your mind, your observation, your experience, your triumph, your lament, your anthem, and then take it and reduce it to one sentence. Big subject, but one sentence. And in that sentence, you can't get all Faulknerian on me. You can't have, clauses and parentheticals. You only get 6 words. Your story, your thoughts, your observations about race in only 6 words. I began doing this 3 years ago. I waited to see what would come back in the inbox. I have archived more than 30,000 of these stories. I have thousands that I have yet to archive because they come in so fast. I'm now like Lucille Ball in that episode where she's at the chocolate factory, trying to keep up and try not to ball them up and eat them, just to try to keep up. But I'm trying to archive all of them in the end, though. Before I leave this earth, I hope I can get back and have a conversation with everyone who shared their story with me, because I want to learn as much as I can about the story behind the 6 words. Often when people send me their stories, they send me essays to explain that, but I'm trying to get back to everyone, to thank them, and also to help fill out this archive, because that's what it's become, is an archive that helps us understand this rich vein in American history. And I'm going to end this part of the talk, before I guess we have a chance to talk with each other, by sharing a version of this with you in a particular manner. Do you know who the actress and monologuist and stage sage is? Anna Devere Smith? Have you ever heard of her? She's Anna Devere Smith. She did the wonderful, she's done a series of stage plays, Fires in the Mirror, The Fire Next Time. Her latest production was about the healthcare system, was called Let Me Down Easy. That's her work on the stage. You may recognize her from television and movie work on TV, if you remember The West Wing. She played the Secretary of State. Tall, light-skinned, very officious. She's now playing another very officious character in the Showtime series Nurse Jackie. She's that hospital administrator that you never ever want to run into. That the one, oh, please save me from her. Well, she has a little bit of officiousness in her for real, and that's what makes her wonderful. She makes things move, and she has a real ear for dialogue. It's what allows her to do her stage work, and she's been an early and enthusiastic cheerleader for the Race Card Project. I post the 6-word stories on a website and allow you to sort of swim through that conversation about race that you know is out there that you don't hear. And she says, Michele, you should take them and you should just mash them together and read them aloud, because when you do, what you realize is the person who sent you 6 words from Oklahoma seems to be speaking to the person who sent you 6 words from Okinawa, because sometimes the 6 words really do now come from distant places. The person in Peoria is talking to the person in Pineville. It feels like this conversation, like people are actually not talking past each other, they're talking to each other. So because when Anna tells you to do something, you just kind of say, yes, ma'am. I did just that. And I want to share some of this with you, because what you will hear here in this is the conversation about race you know is out there, but you don't usually get a chance to hear it because it takes place in a private space. All of these things I'm about to share with you are 6-word submissions that either came to me on a card where someone affixed postage. They either came to me via Twitter, because a lot of people do send them in via social media, or they arrived in the inbox from someone who went online and sent them in the glow of their computer screens. All of these are 6-word truths. Race is experienced by individuals. These are not my words. These are someone else's words. It matters, like it or not. Much ado about nothing. We are still a racist society. Race does not exist by itself. Race is everything, but it's nothing. We wanted equality. We got integration. Soul has no color. Black wears me wherever I go. I admit to unconscious racial bias. Does not define who I am. A costume mistaken for an actor. Who I am not. Racism is a shackle, broke mine. Sometimes racism is self-imposed. Step on backs to raise yourself, still working harder than others are. The point of it all, power, get your feet off our necks. Get is spelled G-I-T, to make sure you get the point. Blacks complain constantly despite obvious progress, but I voted for Barack Obama. Colors run together, why can't people? I hear my grandfather's hateful words. Racism I inherited breaks my heart. Black kid in my math class? This from an 8-year-old. Think Dr. Seuss and the Sneetches. Sometimes when people send them in, particularly if they mail them, you can see their thought process. They write one word, they cross it out, they write another word. Sometimes they're slick and they try to hyphenate a whole bunch of words so that it's really 22 words and they're trying to put it off as 6. This fellow wrote race to the border and then he scratched that out and he said, no, make that race is the border. Born in America, I am America. You can't say that anymore, Grandma. Diversity don't count if it's white. Pay no attention to my packaging. Black children cost less to adopt. I am still not from Vietnam. Please stop saying I am articulate. Do articulate whites also impress you? See me, see black, see nothing. I am fortunate to be Caucasian. I'm only Asian when it's convenient. Ask who I am, not what. Where are you really from? Easy to assume I'm guilty. I assume black women hate me. My great-great-grandfather owned slaves. Would Martin Luther King support gay rights? Born colored, children African American, progress, and several question marks. Can I love who I want? Reason I ended a sweet relationship, a terrible, unnecessary barrier against love. I will not ruin your bloodline. Korean marries Italian in Chinese garden. And then in small letters they wrote, the food was great. No one word to describe me. Obama is mixed, black and white. The hybrid shall inherit the earth. My son is not half, he's double. A child knows when injustice exists. Someone said it all goes downhill after these 6 words. I'm not a racist, but let's all hit the reset button. Every now and then I remember. Grandparents passed, new tree, no roots. Just a German, never a Nazi. My grandfather would hate my children. Terrified, you assume I'm judging you. My natural hair isn't a statement. There's nothing wrong with my hair. Got tired of straightening my hair. Ooh, can I touch your hair? Red hair gets the most stares. I get a lot about hair. Where'd your baby get red hair? Civility heals wounds from the past. Still the elephant in the room. What a tangled web we wove. I feel guilty for my privilege. Rebecca, black maid, taught me love. Didn't sound Chinese on the phone. Really, but you don't look Mexican. I thought you would be taller. You're Jewish, you don't look Jewish. The complicated, cruel history of man. Progressives always gloss over the truth. Conservatives distort truth to promote agenda. Spoke truth, burned at the stake. White, whatever I do is wrong. He said they always get away. Angry black men are so scary. Race doesn't scare me, clothes do. I was taught to fear others. Stop seeing my son as predator. Mugged by black teens, trust destroyed. Suit, degree, still afraid of me. Always putting other people at ease. If Zimmerman's white, Obama's white too. George Zimmerman is someone's son too. Minority obsession and majority guilt trip. Stop exploiting to promote own agenda. We're just not understanding each other. Tonight, let's all walk with our TV. I didn't understand that. I wrote him. I don't understand that one. He said, okay, if you want to understand something about America or something about the neighborhood you live in, take a small TV, tuck it under your arm, and walk through your neighborhood at sunset and see how far you get. I understood that. We don't match, yes, we're family. Sad I learned, sad and hopeful. What if the world were colorblind? Colorblindness is not goal, celebrate colors. Let us all live sweetly together. Start with kids and mix well. Skin color is God's gift wrapping. Our untold stories keep us separate. Total non-issue when the aliens arrive. Checked cosmic in the race box. And I have archived more than 30,000 of these, and this is still my all-time favorite. Underneath, we all taste like chicken. Who knew that you could pack so much in just 6 words? The most important thing I have learned in the researching of this book, in the writing of this book, and the collection of all of these stories about race and cultural identity is that I need to reframe the way I think about what I do. I'm a communicator. I spend most of my life behind microphones. And people think the most important thing I do is talk. The most important thing I do is listen. And there's so much emphasis on communication right now and on what we say, whether it's the conversations that we all hear, frankly, too much of. Do I have to know all your business in the frozen food aisle? We're always talking on devices. We're always sending out texts and tweets. The most important thing any of us do is listen, to make space to listen to each other. And so in the time that we have left, I would love to listen to you, since you've honored me with your ears. Since I'm able to be here with you and not speaking to you from Studio 2A, I'm hoping that we can have if there's some time left for a conversation. Thank you very, very much. It's been an honor to be here.
If I can get this microphone, it's on. Michele will take a few questions from the audience. If there's anyone out there who has a question, I'll go right down front here.
Thank you. I think it was brilliant of you to ask for an abbreviated expression on race, because it's so huge, it's so hard to enter at all. I think it probably helped people focus. But how'd you come up with 6 words?
I knew that there are a lot of 6-word exercises out there, and there have been for a very long time, so I knew that was something that people could grasp. And I have had, at various points in my life, in people who were very important to me, force me to tackle a difficult concept or an idea by reducing it to just 6 words or to a very short expression. I had a professor in college who would tell us, if you want to take on a writing assignment, if you have to first be able, if you can express it in 6 words, you're done. You can put it back together. If you can bring it down to a reduction to 6 words, then you can build it back up. And when I worked at the Washington Post, I had an editor who used to walk the newsroom. And you could talk your way off the front page of the paper if you were asked to explain your story. And if you got all parenthetical about it, and it was like, it's a little bit of this, a little bit of, you're not on the front page, because you clearly haven't tackled the story. But if you could say, it's a classic Cain and Abel tale. 2 people who entered Congress the same year. They were almost like brothers. Now they're both vying for the speakership. And you've found a framework for telling that story. So I knew that it really helped in taking on something that was complex and then reducing it. So I just had a sense that would work. And there is also a nice rhythmic cadence to 6 words. It really does, in terms of rhythm and syntax. And so much of language is, if there are writers in the room, you know that you read out loud. I almost have a metronome going, my toe is always tapping. And so it just was I had a nice cadence to it too. You're welcome. Oh, do you have presents for me?
Well, I have
Since
a
you're wearing a
question.
Santa hat.
I have a question and I also have an answer. First of all, I do have a photograph of the ancient mammy picture. Very
Aunt Jemima
old
picture?
I don't know if it's related to you, but I do own one.
Wow.
I bought it for $1 at a yard sale.
Really?
And I, like most blacks, got very comfortable. I was real comfortable in the 80s and the 90s. And all of a sudden, it struck me again that here it is again, and it never left. So as a person, I'm a member of the NAACP, and I'm going to tell you why. I had to start all over again, and it never does end. It's a never-ending revolution. They told me that I couldn't talk or speak because I was only a member, so I got to be an executive member, so I could speak and have a few words to say and a little bit of input. And to the white gentleman in the room, Bill Clinton got a dangerous walk, and I won't let you know that. Very dangerous. So he learned something from the black men. I think that's about probably all I have to say, but I'd like to talk to you about that picture, and I will try to find out before you leave town the name of the lady that's on it, if it is there.
I appreciate that. I have a collection of Aunt Jemima photos. My grandmother, if you read the book, you'll understand about the work she did. She was an itinerant Aunt Jemima in the late 1940s and early 1950s. And as I told you, no one in my family liked to talk about this. I learned about it from my Uncle Jimmy. When my Uncle Jimmy shared this story, I thought my mother was going to snatch him bald-headed. She was so mad that he told me about this work. And there, you know, the older cousins knew about it. My mom and her siblings all knew about it, of course, but no one talked about it. And during the research, I found out that my grandmother was part of an army of Aunt Jemimas who traveled the country. There were, I think, 3 that worked in Tennessee. She had a 6-state region. She worked Minnesota, the Dakotas, Wisconsin, Iowa, and Michigan. So she traveled as a black woman in the 40s and 50s, which, you know, many people didn't do. And it was good work. I mean, it turned out she was paid very well to do this. But there was an army of women who would go out in the country and do pancake demonstrations. And you might think about it now, well, how hard, you add water and stir. What do you show it? I mean, how difficult is it? But at the time, pancake mix was new. So they were selling convenience cooking. And Quaker Oats was a huge advertiser. What they were doing is they were really introducing a new way of life to people, and they would dress up, and they were often treated as celebrities when they went to town. But Quaker Oats refuses to talk about this. They will not talk about it. There is no official archive for this work. Disney has a little bit of it because Disney, if you went to Disney, up until the early 60s, they had Aunt Jemima's Kitchen at Disney World, and so there are pictures that exist of that, but not a lot of material around the work that these women did. And their stories are really interesting. Many of them were like little, you know, mini C.J. Walkers. They were often the most wealthy black women in their communities because of the money that they made. They bought property. Aunt Jemima in Syracuse owned a lot of property. It turned out that one of them, in later years, cooked for a sorority. And I'm sure that not a sorority, I'm sorry, a fraternity. And I'm sure the fraternity members had no idea that this quiet black woman who was fixing food for them owned property all over Syracuse. Their stories are really interesting. So every time I get another one, I'm so excited. So I can't wait to see this photograph. Thank you very much.
As journalists, we're always forced to leave some of the best stories on the cutting room floor. In this research, what is one of those that didn't make it in the book?
Well, there are family stories that didn't make it in the book because when you write a family memoir, you drag everybody in a boat and no one bought a ticket. And so it's really hard. And you have to make sure that you're telling the family story in a way that is honest, but at the same time in a way that honors everyone. So there are some things that I learned that I wasn't prepared to write about. There are some things I learned that I couldn't source accurately. Because when you're dealing with family history, that's difficult too. You have to triple source everything, and one person remembers it this way, and another person remembers it that way, and a third person remembers it another way. So, you know, building these stories around, that's why I had to go to Birmingham. I had to go and, you know, do a lot of the research to make sure that the stories were all accurate. And I also wanted to go and find out as much as I could about the lives of police officers in Birmingham. And so I tried to find out if any of the officers involved in my father's shooting were still alive. And they were all gone, but I was able to piece together what life was like for them. And that was fascinating for me because, you know, everyone knows about Bull Connor.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine being on Bull Connor's police force. You are seen as the boogeymen of the civil rights movement. And you have to believe that not everyone fully believed in what Bull Connor did. And I learned quite a bit about what life was like for Birmingham police officers. And I put some of it in the book, and it would have taken me sort of in another direction, but I learned a lot about their role in Birmingham society. They were not seen as the sort of the top drawer law enforcement agency. The best and the brightest, and the police officers, the law enforcement officers that were that had the best uniforms, that had the best equipment, that were most respected, worked for the private law enforcement, the private police force that worked for the steel mills. They worked for TCI, and the Birmingham police officers, many of them also during and after the war, carried their own burdens because they were back home and they were watching people return as war heroes. And they were watching people come back wearing military uniforms and being treated as war heroes, and they were wearing police officers' uniforms, and there was all kinds of difficulties that went around that. They had to buy their own firearms. They were not even provided with firearms. They had to purchase their own firearms, often on layaway or credit. So there were lots of things that I learned that when you start doing research, if you're a journalist, then you understand that you start going in rabbit holes and, oh, this is so interesting, and your editor is like, excuse me, you have a deadline, you need to come back here. So there were lots of stories about Birmingham life that were really interesting to me. Rachel and I were talking about this. One of the things that I discovered that Birmingham was probably supposed to be, well, not probably, definitely, Birmingham was supposed to be Atlanta. Birmingham was supposed to be the cultural and the financial center of the American South. And because of the racial strife in Birmingham, and because of the embarrassment that caused to the Birmingham business community, global businesses, international businesses were reticent to do business at a very high level at some point with Birmingham. Birmingham paid a price for that history, and I didn't really understand that. And that's all very well documented, very, very well documented. So there were things like that that I learned that I wish I had, more time to discover. There's one last thing I will share with you is there's a wonderful man at the Birmingham Public Library named Jim Baggett, which I don't know if you know him, but he does the Birmingham. He's fantastic. He was a big help to me in my research. And they did a project because they were trying to understand the parallel lives that different societies live. And so they did a project where they collected snapshots of life in Birmingham. And what they realized is when they went to all kinds of flea markets and garage sales and collected just snapshots of everyday life. First day of school, Christmas, got a new car, whatever, and then they separated them into categories. They realized that even though Black Birmingham and White Birmingham was divided by this gulf that seemed to be 100 miles high and 100 miles wide, that in many cases they were leading the same lives. So when you looked at the pictures, got a new car, it's really striking to see you pose the same way. The family picnic, they all had the same plaid lunch picnic baskets. The first day of school, it's really striking to see no teeth, But you see in those everyday moments how their lives were so similar when they were really supposed to be so separate, and they just weren't.
Clearly, you've done a lot of deep thinking on this subject. I wonder if you might paint a picture or your picture of the future as it relates to race and race relations.
We're probably going to have to come up with a new term or new terminology because when we talk about race, still to this day when we talk about race, we automatically call to mind kind of a civil rights prism. We think about it through a civil rights prism, and we need to update that. I've learned that as a journalist. When you talk about race, because racial categories are somewhat, it gets confusing. So if you're talking about race, you leave out Latinos. Because you're not talking about, so you have to start talking about race and culture and ethnicity. When you talk about race, it increasingly will be there'll be a lot of cross-pollination that's part of that discussion. What it means to be multiracial, biracial, mixed, whatever term you use. It's just, and what happens when America becomes a majority minority country, which is not far off, which has already happened in several American cities. And that's a little bit like jumbo shrimp, a majority, minority, who's a minority? When I speak to high schools, if you are in high school, right, if you are under the age of 18 and you are Caucasian, depending on where you live, you either are a minority already or you will be within 3 years, based on current birth rates. And people are shocked when they think about that and how that relates to discussions around affirmative action, about opportunity, and all the programs that are created to provide opportunities or level the playing field or think about minorities in America. Well, suddenly, who's the minority and who's not? So the conversation about race will be more nuanced. Will require a different kind of terminology, will require probably a lot of fortitude to continue to push forward, and that it will continue. And I guess that's where I will end this, is that the conversation about race is not anywhere near being post-racial. I mean, I think it's actually most racial than post-racial. There's no sort of fixed endpoint. It's something that the framework changes, the issues may change, but the conversation and the reality of race in America continues. And I wrote about this summer, and I think about this a lot because I was doing a lot of research around the March on Washington Film Festival. And at one point I went and looked at how it was covered overseas. And the March on Washington was the first mass event that was truly integrated. It was the first time that many people saw a sea of humanity that included Black and white Americans. That hadn't happened. So at the March on Washington, when people started singing "We Shall Overcome," there were little things that happened. It was the first time in many cases that a Black person has held a white person's hand, because you grabbed the hand of the person that was next to you. And if the person that was next to you happened to be Hispanic, Black, white, whatever, it was the first time often that people had touched someone else. It was the first time that people had seen a big audience that included Black. And overseas, they were fascinated by this. They said, oh, that's America. And to this day, one of the reasons people come here repeatedly is to experience this sort of this nation that has so much diversity. Because so often people come from places that are not diverse. Not diverse in terms of racial background, but also not diverse in terms of religion and the way that it's practiced. We sort of take it for granted and we don't celebrate that. And so as we go forward, maybe we should think about that, and that the thing that other people treasure about this country is something we see as a burden. Oh, that thing that we have to talk about. Oh, that thing that weighs us down. Maybe it's part of what makes us not just unique, but part of what makes us, there's that word, exceptional, in a good way.
I think this may have to be our last question, because we're going to try to wrap up and be outside by about 2:30 so that Michele can do the book signing. So here's our question.
Well, I did want to end this on an optimistic note, and just as an aside, I got to meet Peter Jennings when I was 13 years old, but during his first go-around at ABC, and I think it would be great if you could write a book about your years at ABC, dealing with him, and then also, being there. I think you were there at the same time as Carol Simpson.
I was.
Right? I think that would be great. The comment, though, I think would wrap this up on a positive note, is I think sometimes you don't know where things will take you. When I was a child, I was growing up in St. Louis Park, Minnesota, which I think you're familiar with. Or
St. Louis Park, Minnesota?
Uh-huh.
Oh, wow.
Because you have your Minnesota.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I didn't know this at the time, but, later on, I became aware of the fact that my grandfather, who was a Lithuanian Jewish immigrant, when he moved from the north side of Minneapolis, which, for those of you who don't know the area, is equivalent to the south side of Chicago, the Jewish people moved out of that area and they moved into the suburbs. And he was living in his suburban home. When he sold that home later on, when he got older, he sold it to Carl Rowan.
Really?
And I'm sorry, no, I just blew my. Carl Rowan wanted to buy it. He refused to sell it to him. Years later, when I'm living here, I meet Carl Rowan, and I was able to apologize to him. He didn't even remember the incident, or at least said he didn't, but it made me feel good that I had that ability because, I worked in the Head Start program in Minneapolis when it was fashionable. I will say that. I don't have a halo.
There's no shame in Head Start.
No, well, but no. The point is that I'm saying that I should have. I was young, and maybe I should have been more out of conviction than fashion, and it was conviction as well. But and then I was also involved in the open housing situation in Minneapolis, which be 16 years old was a big deal. So my heart's always been in the right place, and I've tried to carry that out into the everything else.
Thank you for sharing that. In the book I tell the story about we were the first black family to move to the south side of Minneapolis, the far south side. And when we moved into that neighborhood, every white family whose property line touched ours moved out. And in the book I tell this wonderful story about my mother, how she made mischief with that, because the house that they couldn't sell was the house that was directly next to ours. And people would come to look at the house, and my mom, when they found out that black people lived next door, she could see them running for the exit. Oh no, we're not buying that house. So she would start to play games with this, and when she realized that they'd gotten the house next door and they were in the kitchen, and in their kitchen had these big windows that looked out into their backyard and then also ours on the corner lot, right at the point she knew they were about there, she would say, "Showtime." And she'd send my sisters out in the backyard to play. So they would see that they were looking at a house that was next to a black family. And then she would just watch as they would, "Oh, no, thank you," and they would go run away. And they wound up having to sell to the second black family. It was the only way they could sell the house, was that a second black family moved in. One of the things that I discovered, and I need to find a way to either give this to someone or place this on my site or something, because I now gather so many things that are interesting. Under Governor Anderson in Minnesota, and Hubert Humphrey was part of this commission, they had a 12-member commission on integration and housing. And they produced a document that I have a copy of that is astonishing. It's called The Negro in Your Neighborhood. And the impetus behind it is so interesting. They basically threw in 3 panels, folded 3 sides, explain that the reason that you don't see very many Negroes now in your neighborhoods is because of housing patterns and redlining, and that Negroes live in neighborhoods that were designed for Negroes, and that you think that maybe they don't know how to, this is incredible what they're saying. You think maybe they don't know how to take care of their housing, and that you see overcrowding. Well, you see overcrowding because that's the only place they can live. And if you actually spend time, you'll realize that they know how to take care of their houses, and they will make very good neighbors. And with all of that aside, this is the 1950s, and this nation less than 10 years ago was involved in a war that upheld certain principles, and we are not living up to these principles in the state of Minnesota. And it's just this sort of incredible document that kind of wagged a finger at people, and it was sent to every single household in the year before my parents purchased their home. And I find that so interesting, what led to that, and whether sometimes we need documents like that today, that will help people manage change. But thank you very much. Thank you all for spending your afternoon with me.